Officer Mark Carter was a seasoned cop who had worked at the Riverview Police Department for nearly 20 years. On most nights, Riverview was quiet, with the occasional petty crime or drunk causing trouble. But tonight was different. Tonight, Riverview Station would become a nightmare. It started with a call. Around 10 p.m., dispatch reported a disturbance at an old abandoned house on the edge of town. The house had been empty for years, left to rot after a gruesome murder years ago. Locals called it cursed, and no one dared go near it. Mark sighed as he grabbed his flashlight and keys. "Why do these calls always come when I'm about to clock out?" he muttered. "Be careful, Mark," said Claire, the night dispatcher. Her voice carried a hint of worry. Mark waved it off and drove out to the house. The house stood tall and broken against the night sky. Its windows were shattered, and the wooden boards creaked with every gust of wind. Mark parked his car, shining his flashlight at the front door. It was wide open, swinging slightly as if inviting him inside. "Riverview Police," Mark called out as he stepped into the house. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying a faint smell of decay. His boots echoed on the wooden floor as he moved deeper into the darkness. Mark's radio crackled to life. "Officer Carter, are you on scene?" Claire's voice asked. "Yeah, I'm here. Place is empty so far," he replied. But then he heard it, a faint whisper, like someone muttering just out of reach. Mark froze. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone here?" The whispering stopped. Mark followed the sound, his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. The whispers seemed to come from the basement. As he reached the door, he hesitated. The wooden stairs leading down were covered in dust, yet footprints marked a path. Someone had been here recently. The basement was pitch black, and the air felt heavier as Mark descended. His flashlight beam caught old furniture, broken tools, and something odd, a circle drawn on the floor with strange symbols around it. Candles, long since burned out, surrounded the circle. "What the hell?" Mark muttered. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging the basement into darkness. Mark's breathing quickened as he fumbled to fix it. When the light came back, a shadow darted across the wall. "Who's there?" Mark yelled, pulling out his gun. No answer. But then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room. It was tall, with pale skin and empty black eyes that seemed to suck the light out of the room. It didn't move, but Mark felt its gaze pierce him. Mark scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. He radioed for backup, his voice shaking. "Claire, I need units at the old house now. Something's not right here," he said. But Claire didn't respond. Instead, the radio emitted a low, static hiss, followed by a faint laugh. Mark's blood ran cold. That wasn't Claire. He rushed outside to his car, but as he reached it, the engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered, and in their glow, Mark saw the same figure from the basement standing by the edge of the woods. It tilted its head, as if curious, then disappeared into the shadows. Mark didn't wait. He ran back to the station. The police station was supposed to be a place of safety, but when Mark arrived, it felt wrong. The lights inside flickered, and the usually busy front desk was empty. "Claire?" Mark called out, but no one answered. He walked through the station, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The desks were empty, computers still on, but there was no sign of anyone. Then, he heard a scream, a blood-curdling wail that seemed to come from the holding cells. Mark ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. As he reached the cells, he stopped. Inside one of them was Claire. She stood motionless, her back to him. "Claire, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. She didn't move. Mark stepped closer, his gun drawn. "Claire?" Slowly she turned. Her eyes were black, just like the figure in the house. A twisted smile spread across her face as she whispered, "You shouldn't have gone there, Mark." Before Mark could react, the lights in the station went out, leaving him in darkness. He heard whispers again, coming from all around him. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, and every time he turned to look, they vanished. Mark stumbled back toward the main office, desperate to find a way out. But the front doors were locked, and no matter how hard he pulled, they wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Mark fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the noise only grew. Then, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Mark looked up to see the figure from the house standing in front of him. It reached out a hand, and Mark felt an unbearable cold wash over him. "You belong to us now," it said in a voice that echoed in his mind. When officers arrived at the station the next morning, they found it empty. Mark, Claire, and everyone who had been there the night before were gone. The only sign of them was a single message scrawled on the wall in black ink: "They will never leave." To this day, the Riverview Police Department remains abandoned, its halls filled with whispers of those who disappeared. The Riverview Police Station sat empty for years, boarded up and ignored. The town declared it condemned after numerous failed attempts to restore the building. No one wanted to go near it. Locals swore they still heard whispers coming from inside at night, and a few brave souls who dared step onto the grounds claimed to see shadowy figures watching them from the broken windows. By now, the story of Mark Carter, Claire, and the others had become urban legend. Teenagers dared each other to approach the building, and ghost hunters made it a stop on their lists of haunted locations. But no one stayed long enough to uncover the truth, until 2 rookie officers were assigned to the case. Green and Officer Lucy Evans were fresh out of the academy, eager to prove themselves, when a report came in about strange lights seen in the abandoned station. They volunteered to investigate. The older officers at the department warned them against it, but David just laughed. "You don't really believe all that ghost story nonsense, do you?" he said. Sergeant Thompson, a grizzled veteran, shook his head. "Just be careful. And if anything feels wrong, get out. Understood?" David smirked. "Got it." Lucy wasn't so sure. As they approached the station that night, her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. "I don't like this, David," she said quietly. "Relax," David replied. "It's just an old building. We'll take a look, find out what's causing the lights, and be done." But as they parked the car, both officers fell silent. The station loomed before them like a shadow. The front doors were still boarded up, but one window on the second floor glowed faintly, as if someone was inside. "See that?" Lucy whispered. David nodded, suddenly less confident. "Let's make this quick." The officers break through the side door, the lock rusted and weak. Inside, the air was freezing, even though it was warm outside. Their flashlights illuminated the dust-covered desks. Old reports scattered across the floor. "Looks like no one's been here in years," David said, trying to sound calm. "Then why is that light on upstairs?" Lucy whispered. They moved cautiously toward the staircase. As they climbed, the wooden steps creaked loudly beneath them. Somewhere in the distance, they heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Did you hear that?" Lucy stopped. "It's just the building settling," David said, though his voice was shaky. The whispering grew louder the closer they got to the second floor. By the time they reached the top, it sounded like dozens of voices muttering all at once, though none of the words made sense. David shone his flashlight down the hallway. The light revealed rows of closed doors, leading to old offices and storage rooms. At the end of the hall, the faint glow of the light they had seen from outside poured from one open door. "Let's check it out," David whispered. The 2 officers entered cautiously. The room was an old office, empty except for a broken desk, shattered glass on the floor, and a single lit candle sitting in the center of the room. Around it were familiar symbols, drawn in black ash on the wooden floor. Lucy froze. "David, those symbols!" David's flashlight flickered. "This doesn't make sense. Who would come here and do this?" Before she could answer, the whispers started again, louder this time, as though coming from inside the walls. The temperature dropped even further, and Lucy's breath fogged in front of her. She turned toward the hallway and gasped. "David," she choked out, her voice trembling. David turned and saw it too. Shadows moved at the far end of the hall. They grew larger, sliding along the walls and ceiling, their shapes twisting and writhing as they approached. "We need to go," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. They sprinted back down the stairs, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing behind them. Lucy didn't dare look back. She swore she felt something breathing on her neck. The front doors were still blocked, so they ran for the side entrance. The door slammed shut just as David reached it. He pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked! Help me!" he yelled. Lucy grabbed his arm, yanking him away. "The basement, there's a window down there." David hesitated. "The basement? Are you crazy? Do you want to stay up here?" she shouted. They ran for the basement door and threw it open. The stairs groaned as they raced down into the dark. The air grew heavier the deeper they went, and the whispers surrounded them, no longer faint but screaming in their ears. "Keep running," Lucy screamed. At the far end of the basement, they found a small broken window. David kicked out the glass, shoving Lucy through first. She tumbled onto the grass outside, gasping for breath. David followed, his uniform torn and bloody from the glass shards. They didn't stop running until they were back at their patrol car. David fumbled with the keys, starting the engine as the station loomed behind them. Through the cracked windshield, they saw it. A figure stood in the second-floor window, its black eyes locked on them. David and Lucy filed their report the next day, but no one believed them. Other officers laughed it off, saying they'd spooked themselves in an old building. But Sergeant Thompson took them aside, his face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. David nodded. "What is it? What's in that building?" Thompson sighed. "We don't know. Whatever happened to Mark Carter and the others, it left something behind. Some say it's evil. Some say it's the souls of the ones who disappeared. All I know is, no one who goes into that place comes back the same." David and Lucy left Riverview soon after. They transferred to different departments, unable to shake the feeling that something from the station still watched them. Both officers claimed they could hear whispers when they were alone, faint, almost inaudible, but always there. The Riverview police station remains abandoned to this day. Most people avoid it, but occasionally someone goes inside. Ghost hunters, thrill seekers, or skeptics who don't believe the stories. None of them ever return. And on quiet nights, if you stand outside the station, you might see a figure in the window, watching, waiting, whispering. Years passed. The Riverview police station remained untouched, rotting slowly under the weight of time and the terrible events tied to it. Yet, stories of the haunted station only grew. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside at night, convinced they were braver than the ones who came before them. One night, a group of high school students decided to test their courage. There were 4 of them: Emma, Alex, Jordan, and Chris. They had heard the stories of Mark Carter, the missing officers, and the whispers, but they didn't believe any of it. "It's just an old building," Alex said, trying to sound confident. "People get scared and make up stories." Jordan grinned. "Then let's prove it. We stay inside for an hour. If anyone leaves early, they lose." Emma shifted uncomfortably. "What if the stories are true?" Chris, who was tie-quiet one of the group, finally spoke up. "It's just a game, Em. Nothing's gonna happen." With flashlights and a camera in hand, they made their way toward the station as the moon hung low in the cloudy sky. The building seemed to loom taller in the dark, its broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. "This place gives me the creeps," Emma muttered as they reached the side door. The lock had rusted off years ago, and the door creaked open as they stepped inside. The group gathered in the station's main lobby, where old desks and paperwork lay scattered like the place had been abandoned yesterday. The air was icy, colder than it had been outside. "Okay," Jordan said, checking his watch. 1 hour, starting now." The group split up to explore. Alex and Jordan wandered toward the offices, while Emma and Chris hesitated near the holding cells. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, but every step made the silence feel heavier. "See?" Alex called from down the hall. "Nothing here. Just dust and—" Suddenly, His flashlight flickered. Alex froze. "Did you see that?" Jordan whispered. "What?" Jordan shone his light toward the end of the hallway. A door slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but blackness inside. "I thought I saw someone move," Jordan said, his voice quieter now. "Stop messing with me," Alex replied, trying to shake it off. But neither of them laughed. Meanwhile, Chris and Emma stood near the holding cells. "It's freezing in here," Emma said, rubbing her arm. Chris looked at the walls, shining his flashlight over them. "Why are there handprints here?" he asked quietly. Emma turned. Dark, smeared handprints covered the inside of one of the holding cell doors, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Her flashlight trembled in her hand. "Let's get the others," she said. As they turned to leave, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma screamed, and Chris grabbed her arm. "It's just the wind," Chris stammered, though he didn't sound convinced. But the whispering began, faint at first, like dozens of voices murmuring from far away. The sound echoed off the walls, growing louder, until it surrounded them. "Chris," Emma whispered, tears filling her eyes. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, pulling her toward the lobby. In the hallway, Alex and Jordan heard the basement door slam. "What was that?" Alex asked, his voice cracking. "Maybe the others," Jordan started, but then he saw something. A shadow darted across the floor, fast and unnatural, like it was alive. Jordan froze. "Did you see that?" Alex didn't answer. His flashlight flickered again, and the whispers began to fill the air, low voices muttering things they couldn't understand. Then they heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward them from the darkness. "Who's there?" Alex yelled, his voice shaking. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its pale face stretched into an unnatural grin. Its eyes were black voids, sucking in the light from their flashlights. The figure tilted its head as if studying them, then took a step forward. "Run!" Jordan screamed. The four friends collided in the lobby, panic written on their faces. "We have to leave," Emma cried. "The door," Chris pointed to the side entrance they had come through, but it was gone. The door, once wide open, was now just a solid wall. "How is that possible?" Alex shouted, pounding on it. The whispers turned to screams. Shadows swirled around them, moving across the walls and floors like living things. Emma dropped to her knees, covering her ears. "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Chris grabbed her, trying to pull her to her feet. "We need to find another way out." The group sprinted toward the stairwell, desperate for an exit. They ran up to the second floor, but every hallway looked the same, endless rows of doors leading nowhere. "This isn't real," Jordan panted. "It can't be real." The whispers grew louder until they became voices, clear and sharp. "Stay with us." Chris turned and saw them. Shadows moved toward the group from all sides, merging together to form tall figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. One of them stepped closer, reaching out a clawed hand. "Leave us alone," Alex screamed, swinging his flashlight at it. The beam passed through the figure, but for a moment, it vanished, like smoke dissolving into the air. "Flashlights!" Chris yelled. "They don't like the light!" The group huddled together, their flashlights shining in all directions, holding the shadows at bay. But the batteries were already starting to fade. "They're going to go out," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're not going to make it," Jordan said, his voice hollow. Chris looked at the others, determination in his eyes. "We have to find the basement window. That's our only way out." They sprinted back down the stairs, the flashlights flickering with every step. The basement door was wide open now, as if waiting for them. "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "We can't go down there. It's the only way," Chris said firmly. The group ran into the basement, their flashlight beams bouncing wildly. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The circle of symbols still covered the floor, as if mocking them. "There!" Alex pointed to the broken window at the far end. They raced toward it, but the shadows poured into the room like a black fog. The figures emerged again, clawing at the edges of the light. One of them grabbed Jordan's leg, pulling him back. "Help me!" he screamed. Chris lunged forward, pulling Jordan free. "Keep going." Alex climbed through the window first, then Emma. Chris pushed Jordan through next, but as he turned to climb out, his flashlight died. The shadows swarmed him. "Chris!" Emma screamed from outside. Chris shoved himself through the window at the last second, tumbling onto the grass outside. He gasped for air, looking back at the window. The shadows stopped just inside, retreating like smoke as the light from the moon hit them. The four of them stumbled to their feet, shaking and covered in dirt. The station loomed behind them, silent and still. "We're alive," Emma whispered. Chris stared at the broken window, his face pale. "It let us go." Jordan turned to look one last time. In the second-floor window, a tall figure watched them, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The Riverview police station was eventually demolished. The land was paved over, and a park was built where it once stood, but the whispers never stopped. People walking through the park at night still claim to hear faint voices carried on the wind, and some say they see shadows flickering in the corners of their eyes. The station may be gone, but something remains, and it's still waiting. The town of Riverview took pride in the new park. A playground sat in the center, surrounded by neatly trimmed grass and newly planted trees. Families gathered during the day, their children laughing and running through the open spaces. People began to forget the stories of the old police station, stories that had been buried along with the building's ruins. But the nights were different. The park grew unnaturally quiet after sundown. The lampposts scattered around the area would sometimes flicker, and a cold breeze always seemed to pass through. People walking their dogs after dark noticed that their pets would stop suddenly, staring into the trees or at empty corners, growling or whimpering as though they saw something unseen. Then came the whispers. It began with a jogger. A man named Tom liked to run through the park late at night when it was empty. One evening, as he passed the playground, he thought he heard something, a faint murmur carried on the wind. He stopped, pulling out his earbuds and looking around. The park was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing. "Anyone there?" No answer. Tom shook his head and turned to leave, but the whispers began again, soft, just at the edge of hearing, like dozens of voices speaking all at once. He spun around, his flashlight scanning the empty swings and the play structure. As the beam of light passed over the jungle gym, he froze. Someone was standing there. A tall figure stood on the top platform, its shape barely visible in the dark. Its head tilted slowly, watching him. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the figure seemed to move, without making a sound, toward the slide. Tom ran. He sprinted across the park, the whispers growing louder with every step, until he reached his car and sped home. He never went back to the park at night, and he refused to talk about what he saw. But soon, others began to experience the same thing. People started reporting eerie encounters at the park. Children playing there during the day spoke of seeing shadow people near the trees. Parents dismissed it as imagination until they, too, heard the whispers when no one else was around. One night, a teenager named Mia was dared by her friends to spend 15 minutes in the park after dark. Armed with only a flashlight, she sat nervously on one of the swings, watching the empty playground in front of her. The first 5 minutes passed in silence, then the temperature dropped. Her breath fogged the air, and the swing creaked beneath her. Mia's flashlight flickered as a shadow passed by the edge of the playground. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The whispers came next, dozens of voices murmuring all around her, growing louder and louder. Her flashlight went out completely, plunging her into darkness. And then, she heard it, soft footsteps moving across the grass. Mia froze, too terrified to move. She felt a cold presence behind her, as though someone was standing inches away. Slowly, she turned her head. A face stared back, pale and twisted, its black eyes empty and unblinking. It grinned at her, an unnatural smile stretching far too wide. Mia screamed and bolted out of the park. Her friends found her trembling at the edge of the road, her face pale and her flashlight shattered. She never spoke about what she saw, but from that night on, she refused to go anywhere near the park. Word spread through Riverview that the park was haunted, but the town refused to acknowledge it. Officials dismissed the stories as hysteria or pranks. "There's no such thing as ghosts," the mayor said during a town meeting. But some of the older residents knew better. Sergeant Thompson, now retired, shook his head as he listened to the news. "They never should have built that park," he muttered to himself. One evening, Thompson drove past the park on his way home. The swings moved gently in the wind, though the air outside was still. As he stopped at a red light near the entrance, he thought he saw someone standing beneath the trees. It was tall and thin, its figure barely visible in the dark. Slowly, it turned its head toward him. Thompson's blood ran cold. He gripped the steering wheel, his hands trembling as he looked away. The whispers began faintly in his ears, so soft he could almost convince himself they weren't real. When the light turned green, he drove away without looking back. Despite the stories, the town ignored the warnings, until a boy went missing. 8-year-old Lucas was playing in the park one evening, while his mother sat on a nearby bench. The sun was setting, and the lamplights began to flicker on. Lucas ran toward the playground to go down the slide one last time. His mother watched him climb the steps, but as he disappeared into the tube slide, he never came out the other end. She waited, calling his name. "Lucas?" There was no answer. She ran to the slide, her heart pounding. She called for him again, her voice shaking, but Lucas was gone. The police searched the entire park and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the boy. The playground was torn apart, the slide removed and examined, but nothing was found. Lucas's disappearance became national news, but no answers ever came. After Lucas vanished, the town closed the park. A fence was erected around it, and signs reading "Keep Out" were posted. The playground sat abandoned, its swings creaking in the wind, the slide empty and silent. But some nights, people still hear the whispers. A local reporter, curious about the story, snuck into the park one evening. He set up a camera and began recording, determined to capture proof of the paranormal. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then his camera began to glitch, and the whispers started. The video was later recovered from his belongings. The footage showed the empty playground, the lamplights flickering. But at the end of the video, the camera caught something, just for a second. A figure stood on the top of the jungle gym, its pale face staring into the lens, its mouth slowly forming into a grin. The reporter was never seen again. The land where the police station once stood, and where the park now sits, remains cursed. The shadows that were awakened long ago have not left. They wait, watching from the darkness, whispering to anyone who comes too close. Some believe the spirits of the missing officers are still there, trapped in the place where they vanished. Others say it's something much older, something evil that was disturbed when the symbols were first found. Whatever it is, it has claimed Riverview as its home, and it's always waiting for its next victim. If you ever find yourself in Riverview and someone dares you to visit the old park at night, do yourself a favor. Don't go, and if you hear the whispers, run.